I am Miss Marple, and this village is never as quiet as it appears. Welcome to my new case.
The December frost had settled over St. Mary Mead like powdered sugar on a Christmas cake, transforming the village green into a crystalline wonderland where ancient oaks stood sentinel over the evening's carol rehearsal. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her woolen shawl and settled into her favorite chair by the window, her knitting needles resting idle in her lap as she observed the familiar tableau unfolding before her. From this vantage point, she could see everything worth seeing, and in her considerable experience, everything was always worth seeing if one knew how to look. The village had gathered for their traditional Christmas Eve practice, voices blending in harmonious preparation for the midnight service. Mrs. Dollop from the bakery bustled about with steaming mugs of mulled wine, her usually cheerful demeanor somewhat strained this evening. Miss Marple noticed how the woman's hands trembled slightly as she served, and how she kept glancing toward the church tower where the bells hung silent, waiting for their ceremonial chimes. Captain Pembroke stood near the war memorial, his military bearing as rigid as ever despite his recent retirement to the village. His walking stick, far too elegant for practical use, caught the lamplight as he gestured emphatically to young Police Constable Davies, who listened with the patient expression of a man accustomed to unwelcome advice. Miss Marple observed the subtle tension in the constable's shoulders, the way his hand moved unconsciously to straighten his uniform when the captain spoke. There had been words between them recently about some matter of village security, though the exact nature remained unclear. Nearby, Juliet Hargreaves hovered at her uncle's elbow with the practiced invisibility of a paid companion. The girl wore a simple black coat that had seen better seasons, and her gloved hands clutched a letter that she kept tucking and retucking into her pocket. Miss Marple had noticed the London postmark earlier at the post office, and wondered what opportunities might be calling the young woman away from Pembroke's increasingly demanding household. The Reverend Clement emerged from the vestry, his keys jingling as he secured the door behind him. He paused, frowning slightly at something Miss Marple couldn't quite see, then shook his head and joined the gathering. Dr. Haydock arrived fashionably late, his medical bag in hand, despite the festive occasion, a habit that spoke of long years attending to village emergencies at the most inconvenient moments. As the first tentative notes of Silent Night drifted across the green, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a small detail that others might have dismissed. A muddy footprint on the church steps, too large for the Reverend's modest shoes and bearing the distinctive tread of a police-issue boot. Curious, since Constable Davies stood clearly visible among the carolers, his own boots showing no trace of fresh mud. The singing swelled, voices joining in the familiar comfort of tradition when a sharp cry pierced the harmonious evening air. Young Tommy Finch, the baker's son, stumbled from the shadows behind the church, his face white as the frost beneath his feet. "Constable Davies," he gasped, pointing a trembling finger toward the darkness. "In the bell tower. He's not moving." The carol died mid-verse as if someone had lifted the needle from a gramophone record. Dr. Haydock was the first to move, his medical training overriding the shock that held the others frozen. The Reverend Clement followed, his keys already in hand, while Captain Pembroke pushed forward with the authority of a man accustomed to taking charge in crises. Miss Marple remained in her chair, though her fingers had found her knitting needles and begun their familiar rhythm. She watched the faces around her with the same careful attention she might give to a particularly complex pattern. Mrs. Dollop's hand flew to her throat, genuine surprise written clearly in her features. Juliet Hargreaves went very still, that letter crackling softly in her suddenly clenched fist. The Reverend's expression showed confusion rather than shock, as if he were trying to reconcile something that didn't quite fit his expectations. Through her window, Miss Marple could see the small procession disappearing into the church, their voices carrying back across the frosty air in urgent, hushed tones. The bells remained silent in their tower, their Christmas chimes postponed indefinitely. In the growing darkness, the village green stood empty, except for the abandoned mugs of cooling wine and the magnificent Christmas tree, its lights twinkling with innocent cheer over a scene that had suddenly become far less innocent indeed. The gentle rhythm of Miss Marple's needles continued, steady and thoughtful, as she began to consider the curious matter of muddy footprints and the expression she had glimpsed on certain faces when young Tommy had made his dreadful announcement. The small procession emerged from the church with the gravity of pallbearers, though they carried only the weight of terrible knowledge. Dr. Haydock led the way, his medical bag clutched tightly in one hand, while the other brushed frost from his coat with mechanical precision. Behind him, Captain Pembroke's military bearing seemed more pronounced than usual, as if discipline might somehow restore order to a world that had suddenly tilted off its axis. "I'm afraid there can be no doubt," Dr. Haydock announced to the small gathering still clustered around the war memorial, his breath forming small clouds in the bitter air. "Constable Davies is dead. The circumstances?" He paused, choosing his words with the careful precision of a man who understood that in a village, every syllable would be repeated and examined. "The circumstances require immediate investigation by the proper authorities." The Reverend Clement appeared in the church doorway, his keys jangling with nervous energy. "I shall telephone the county police at once," he said, though his voice carried an odd tremor that suggested the task felt somehow inadequate to the magnitude of what had occurred. Miss Marple rose from her chair and stepped onto her garden path, ostensibly to gather the evening's post, but actually to position herself where she might better observe the unfolding drama. From this vantage point, she could see the muddy footprint on the church steps more clearly, too large for the Reverend's modest shoes and bearing a distinctive herringbone tread that caught what little light remained of the winter evening. Mrs. Dollop had sunk onto the bench beside the memorial, her usually ruddy complexion now matching the grey winter sky. "Poor soul," she murmured, wringing her hands in her apron with such violence that Miss Marple wondered if the gesture spoke more of personal distress than general sympathy. "And on Christmas Eve, of all nights, what will people think?" The question hung in the frosty air with peculiar weight. Miss Marple had long observed that Mrs. Dollop's first concern was rarely for the deceased themselves, but rather for the potential disruption to village routine. Yet tonight there seemed something more personal in her distress, a quality that spoke of specific worry rather than general dismay. Juliet Hargreaves stood frozen near the church gate, that mysterious London letter still clutched in her gloved hand. The girl's eyes darted between the church entrance and the path leading to her uncle's house, as if calculating distances or possibilities. When Captain Pembroke's voice boomed across the green, demanding to know about proper procedures and chain of command, Juliet started as if awakened from a trance. "I should inform the authorities," she said to no one in particular, though her uncle had already taken charge with his customary military efficiency. "Uncle Pembroke always says proper procedures must be followed in matters of—" Her voice trailed off as she realized the awkwardness of her words. Young Tommy Finch, restored to speech by the proud drama of being the messenger, told his tale again to anyone who would listen. He had gone behind the church to look for the stray kitten that had taken shelter in the coal scuttle. He had seen the tower door standing ajar. He had called up the narrow stairs and, receiving no answer, climbed to investigate. He was lying there so still, Tommy concluded, his voice dropping to an awed whisper, like he was sleeping, but his eyes were open. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a small detail that others might have dismissed, a thread of pale twine clinging to the rough wood of the tower doorframe. Not thread exactly, more like the thin parcel twine found at any post office or sensible kitchen. She tucked this observation away alongside the curious footprint and Mrs. Dollop's trembling hands. Dr. Haydock returned from making his preliminary examination, his expression grave. "No obvious signs of struggle," he confided to Captain Pembroke, though his voice carried clearly in the still air. "A blow to the head, certainly, but there are also marks on the hands and wrists." Rope burns, I should say. The word rope seemed to settle over the gathering like another layer of frost. Mrs. Dollop's teacup rattled against its saucer with sudden violence, while Juliet Hargreaves went very still, her breathing shallow and quick. "The bell ropes," someone whispered, and all eyes turned toward the silent tower where the Christmas chimes should have been ringing out across the village green. Captain Pembroke cleared his throat with military authority. "We must preserve the scene until proper investigators arrive. No one else enters the church. The rest of us should return to our homes and avoid unnecessary speculation." Yet even as he spoke these sensible words, Miss Marple observed how his walking stick showed a faint reddish stain on its ferrule, the color of brick dust or powdered tile. The church tower steps were ancient stone, but the vestry roof had been repaired just last month with new tiles that would crumble easily in the frost. The Christmas tree lights continued their cheerful blinking, casting shifting shadows across faces that no longer looked quite as innocent as they had an hour before. In the growing darkness, Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm as she began to consider the curious matter of muddy footprints, pale twine, and the various expressions she had glimpsed when young Tommy made his dreadful announcement. The county police arrived with the subdued efficiency of professionals accustomed to rural emergencies, though the sleek black motor car seemed oddly out of place against the ancient stones of St. Mary Mead. Inspector Fletcher emerged first, a compact man whose thoughtful eyes suggested he had learned to listen before speaking, a quality that immediately distinguished him from the usual run of officials who descended upon villages with predetermined notions and urban impatience. Miss Marple, who had drifted closer to the church with the unremarkable certainty of someone checking her garden gate, observed how Fletcher examined the muddy footprint on the church steps with genuine interest rather than dismissive haste. "Herringbone tread," she mentioned gently, as if commenting on the weather. "Quite distinct and rather larger than one might expect from our local constabulary." Fletcher glanced at her with the sharp attention of a man who recognized useful observation when he heard it. He bent again to examine the print more closely, noting its depth and the particular pattern that spoke of expensive boots rather than standard police issue. When Dr. Haydock repeated his preliminary findings about the rope burns and the blow to the head, Fletcher's questions carried the methodical precision of someone building a case rather than rushing toward convenient conclusions. The Reverend Clement provided the church keys with hands that trembled slightly. Whether from cold or shock remained unclear. As Fletcher and the doctor climbed the narrow tower stairs, Miss Marple positioned herself near the west door where the thin strand of pale twine still clung to the rough door frame. She had observed such twine before, the sort used for parcels at Mrs. Dollop's bakery, though this particular piece showed signs of having been cut rather than broken. Mrs. Dollop herself remained near the memorial, her earlier nervousness having evolved into something approaching genuine distress. When Fletcher emerged from his examination and began organizing formal statements, she stepped forward with the eager helpfulness of someone anxious to be useful. Yet Miss Marple noticed how the woman's eyes avoided the church tower entirely, focusing instead on her hands, which continued their nervous worrying at her apron strings. Captain Pembroke's military bearing seemed more pronounced in the presence of official authority, his walking stick tapping against the frozen ground with rhythmic precision. The faint, reddish stain on its ferrule had not escaped Miss Marple's attention, particularly since the church tower steps were ancient stone while the vestry roof had been recently repaired with new tiles that would crumble easily under pressure. Juliet Hargreaves stood apart from the small crowd, that mysterious London letter still pressed against her coat pocket. When Fletcher began taking preliminary statements, she answered his questions with the practiced invisibility of someone accustomed to remaining unnoticed. Yet Miss Marple observed how the girl's breathing quickened whenever the conversation turned to timing, particularly when the Reverend mentioned that Constable Davies had completed his regular patrol at 7:30. This detail settled into Miss Marple's consciousness with particular significance. She had clearly observed Davies among the carolers at 8 o'clock, his uniform neat and his boots showing no trace of mud. Yet Dr. Haydock estimated the time of death at approximately 8:30, based on the body's temperature and other unmistakable signs. The discrepancy suggested that Davies had returned to the church for some specific purpose after completing his patrol and joining the carol practice. Young Tommy Finch, emboldened by his role as the evening's primary witness, had begun elaborating on his discovery with the natural tendency of youth to improve upon reality. Fletcher listened patiently to these embellishments while making careful notes about the actual facts. The tower door standing ajar, the position of the body, the strange stillness that had first alerted the boy to something amiss. As Fletcher organized his investigation, Miss Marple bent to examine the holly bush beside the church steps, ostensibly admiring the particularly fine berries. Hidden beneath the frost-covered branches lay a single brass button, tarnished with age and bearing several threads of dark wool that spoke of expensive tailoring rather than village practicality. She tucked this discovery quietly into her reticule, recognizing it as the sort of detail that might prove significant once the larger picture became clear. The official photographer arrived as the evening deepened, his flash powder casting stark shadows across the church interior. Fletcher's methodical approach impressed Miss Marple, though she noticed he focused primarily on obvious evidence: the rope burns, the head wound, the general condition of the bell chamber. The smaller inconsistencies that had caught her attention seemed to escape his immediate notice, though she suspected he would discover them in due course. By the time the formal statements were concluded and the church properly sealed, the village had begun to settle into that peculiar mixture of excitement and unease that follows unexpected tragedy. Miss Marple made her way home along the frost-slicked path, her knitting needles finding their familiar rhythm as she considered the curious collection of details that had already begun to form a pattern in her mind. The Christmas tree lights continued their cheerful blinking, casting shifting shadows across a scene that had become considerably more complex than a simple case of village crime. Morning arrived with that peculiar clarity that follows tragedy, when frost transforms familiar landscapes into something foreign and every shadow seems to harbor secrets. Miss Marple positioned herself by her kitchen window with morning tea, observing the steady procession of villagers making their way to Inspector Fletcher's temporary headquarters in the village hall. The church remained sealed, its ancient stones bearing witness to violence that had shattered the Christmas peace. Mrs. Dollop arrived first for her formal interview, her usual confident stride replaced by careful, measured steps. She emerged 20 minutes later, looking considerably more flustered than when she entered, her hands worrying at her apron strings with unconscious anxiety. Miss Marple noted how the woman avoided looking toward the church tower entirely, focusing instead on the path ahead with determined concentration. Captain Pembroke's interview lasted considerably longer, his military bearing evident even from a distance as he gestured emphatically through the hall's tall windows. Miss Marple observed how his walking stick remained propped against the wall outside. Curious, since he rarely moved without it, claiming an old war wound required constant support. The reddish stain on its ferrule had darkened overnight, becoming more pronounced rather than fading as ordinary dirt might. Inspector Fletcher's methodical questioning had begun to construct a compelling narrative. Mrs. Dollop, eager to contribute and perhaps divert attention from her own nervous state, recounted the heated argument she had witnessed between Captain Pembroke and Constable Davies just a week prior. The dispute concerned boundary lines near the captain's property and Davies's perceived leniency with local poachers. "The captain was quite beside himself, Inspector," Mrs. Dollop reported, her voice carrying that particular tone of someone relishing dramatic importance. "He said Constable Davies was a disgrace to the uniform and that he'd regret his insolence." Such terrible words, and now look what's happened. This testimony, combined with Captain Pembroke's blustering and uncooperative manner during questioning, began painting a clear picture for the county police. Fletcher, though thorough, was also pragmatic. An obvious suspect with a documented temper, clear motive, and physical evidence, It formed a narrative that fit neatly into the framework of sudden, regrettable violence. The walking stick provided the most damning evidence. A junior constable, following Fletcher's instructions to examine potential weapons, had noted the faint reddish stain on the captain's highly polished cane. When questioned, Pembroke dismissed it curtly as mere garden dirt, but his eyes flickered with momentary unease. The stain, Miss Marple suspected, would prove to be brick dust from the crumbling vestry roof tiles, consistent with Dr. Haydock's assessment of the fatal head wound. Miss Marple listened from her unobtrusive corner, ostensibly knitting a missionary scarf, while her sharp eyes moved between Inspector Fletcher and the emerging evidence. She noted how Fletcher's shoulders relaxed slightly, satisfaction evident in his expression as the pieces fell into place. The herringbone footprint remained unexplained, but with such compelling evidence against Captain Pembroke, it seemed a minor inconsistency. Yet Miss Marple remained unconvinced. The muddy print's distinctive tread pattern didn't match the captain's boots, nor did they show similar mud staining. While he undoubtedly possessed a volatile temper, his anger typically carried theatrical quality, more for effect than murderous intent. The timing troubled her as well. Davies had been clearly visible among the carolers at 8 o'clock, with death occurring around past. What had drawn him back to the church tower for what appeared to be a prearranged meeting? The brass button she had discovered beneath the holly bush continued to puzzle her. Its expensive tailoring and torn threads suggested a struggle, but Captain Pembroke's dark wool coat appeared intact. The pale twine clinging to the tower door frame spoke of careful preparation rather than spontaneous violence, and the missing constable's notebook suggested premeditation that didn't align with a heated confrontation. Juliet Hargreaves emerged from her interview looking fragile as spun glass, that mysterious London letter still pressed against her coat pocket. Her alibi, assisting her uncle with Christmas preparations, was easily corroborated by Captain Pembroke himself, though he offered it with dismissive certainty that felt almost rehearsed. As the morning progressed, village opinion began solidifying around Captain Pembroke's guilt. The evidence seemed overwhelming: motive, opportunity, weapon, and a documented history of conflict with the victim. Inspector Fletcher's methodical approach had yielded what appeared to be a straightforward case of a gentleman's temper turning deadly. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and continued her steady knitting rhythm, her needles clicking softly as she considered the growing collection of inconsistencies. The obvious solution often served as an excellent smokescreen for something far more intricate, and human nature, in her considerable experience, rarely proved as simple as it first appeared. The Christmas tree lights continued their cheerful blinking across the green, casting shifting shadows that seemed to dance with secrets not yet ready to be revealed. The village had found its villain, but Miss Marple suspected the true story remained carefully hidden beneath layers of misdirection and calculated deception. By midday, the village had settled into that peculiar mixture of satisfaction and unease that follows the identification of an obvious culprit. Inspector Fletcher's methodical approach had yielded what appeared to be a compelling case against Captain Pembroke, and the county police seemed eager to wrap up the investigation before Christmas Day arrived with its demands for normalcy and celebration. Miss Marple, however, found herself increasingly troubled by the very tidiness that pleased others. She tied on her felt hat with characteristic decisiveness and stepped into the crisp winter air, ostensibly for her daily constitutional, but actually to pursue the small inconsistencies that had been accumulating in her mind like snowflakes on a window-sill. Her first stop was Mrs. Dollop's bakery, where the proprietress was measuring currants with unusual concentration, her normally steady hands showing a slight tremor that spoke of nerves rather than cold. The woman's greeting came before Miss Marple could speak, as if she had been rehearsing it. 2 dozen mince pies for the vicarage, Mrs. Dollop announced, and a tray for the carolers that won't be needed now. Poor lambs. Her usually rosy cheeks appeared mottled, and she avoided direct eye contact with determined efficiency. Miss Marple accepted a paper-wrapped parcel of biscuits and observed mildly, "You were so very organized last evening. I noticed the string you use for parcels. Very sensible quality. It looked quite similar to a piece that caught on the church door." Mrs. Dollop's hands paused momentarily before she recovered with a forced laugh. "We get it from the wholesaler in Much Benham. Pale twine, 7-ply. Nothing particular about it. Half the village borrows lengths at Christmas. Mr. Cottle took some for the garlands, and Miss Hargreaves stopped by for a yard or two." Said Captain, "Pembroke had parcels for the post." Miss Marple noted how the ball of twine near the till showed a fresh, clean cut, rather than the frayed end one might expect from casual use. She also observed that Mrs. Dollop's nervous chatter revealed more than intended, particularly the detail about Juliet Hargreaves requesting twine for her uncle's parcels. The post office yielded even more significant information. Mrs. Trimble, whose knowledge of village correspondence was both comprehensive and indiscreet, proved eager to share her observations about recent postal activities. Most significantly, she revealed that Constable Davies had posted a registered letter to the county offices in Much Benham at 7:15 the previous evening, just before joining the carol practice. "He asked about the last dispatch time twice," Mrs. Trimble confided, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone providing crucial intelligence. "Seemed quite particular about ensuring it would reach its destination promptly." This detail settled into Miss Marple's consciousness with profound significance. If Davies had been conducting official business requiring registered correspondence, it suggested he had discovered something requiring formal documentation, something that might well be recorded in his missing notebook. Mrs. Trimble's revelations continued with practiced efficiency. She had observed Juliet Hargreaves receiving regular correspondence from Pemberton, Wickham and Associates, a prestigious London solicitor's office, and had recently posted a lengthy reply on expensive writing paper. Additionally, Mrs. Dollop had been conducting extensive correspondence with a London bakery supplier about substantial business expansion, the sort of investment requiring considerable capital. As Miss Marple made her way home, she encountered young Tommy Finch lingering near her garden gate with the restless energy of someone wrestling with adult concerns. His initial excitement at discovering the body had given way to genuine distress, and he possessed the clarity of observation that adults often dismissed in their eagerness for convenient explanations. Over cocoa in her warm kitchen, Tommy provided crucial details that had been overlooked in the official investigation. "The thing is, Miss Marple, Constable Davies' notebook wasn't there. He always carried it in his left breast pocket. I've seen him writing in it dozens of times during his rounds. But when I found him, that pocket was empty." This observation confirmed Miss Marple's growing suspicions about the deliberate nature of the crime. Tommy continued with increasing confidence, describing how the bell ropes had been tangled frantically, as if someone had been pulling on them desperately. But Constable Davies knew those bells better than anyone. He wouldn't have gotten himself caught up accidentally. The image of Davies struggling to ring the Christmas bells as a signal for help painted a very different picture from the sudden violence suggested by Captain Pembroke's alleged guilt. The rope burns on Davies' wrists began to form a new pattern in Miss Marple's mind. Not restraint, but desperate attempts at communication. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Miss Marple observed the postman, Mr. Sims, making his rounds with characteristic efficiency. His navy greatcoat caught her attention immediately. One brass button was missing from the second row, leaving ragged threads that matched perfectly with the tarnished button she had discovered beneath the holly bush. His boots, she noted with growing certainty, bore the distinctive herringbone tread that had left its mark on the church steps. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a pattern that had nothing to do with Captain Pembroke's volatile temper, and everything to do with careful planning and calculated deception. The registered letter, the missing notebook, the deliberate removal of evidence, all spoke of someone who understood the importance of controlling information and eliminating witnesses to inconvenient discoveries. As evening approached and the first snowflakes began to fall, Miss Marple positioned herself by her kitchen window to observe the village green. The Christmas tree lights continued their cheerful blinking, casting shifting shadows that seemed to dance with secrets. It was then that she noticed Juliet Hargreaves walking swiftly past, her head bowed against the wind, clutching a small package wrapped in plain brown paper and secured with a length of pale, familiar twine. The sight of that twine, identical to what had been found at the church tower, connected the final elements in Miss Marple's mind with sudden, unsettling clarity. The village might have accepted its obvious suspect, but she knew that true evil often hid behind the most unremarkable facades, and the most crucial clues were invariably the ones that others dismissed as insignificant details. Her knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm as she contemplated the curious matter of Christmas preparations that had gone so terribly wrong, and the various masks that people wore when they believed themselves safely unobserved. The evening brought with it the peculiar quality of light that precedes heavy snow, when familiar landscapes take on an almost ethereal quality and ordinary details seem to shimmer with hidden significance. Miss Marple, having observed Juliet Hargreaves disappear into the gathering dusk with her mysterious package, found herself drawn to make a brief constitutional around the village green, ostensibly to admire the Christmas decorations, but actually to pursue several nagging inconsistencies that had been accumulating in her mind like frost on a window pane. Her path took her past Mrs. Dollop's bakery, where warm light spilled from the windows onto the snow-covered pavement. Through the glass, she could see the proprietress moving about with unusual agitation, her normally confident demeanor replaced by nervous energy that spoke of deeper troubles than seasonal business pressures. The ball of pale twine visible on the counter showed a fresh, clean cut rather than the frayed end one might expect from casual use, a small detail that connected with the strands she had observed clinging to the church tower doorframe. The post office yielded its own revelations when Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Trimble locking up for the evening. The postmistress, always eager to share her comprehensive knowledge of village correspondence, proved particularly forthcoming about recent postal irregularities that had been troubling her methodical mind. "Most peculiar, Miss Marple," Mrs. Trimble confided, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. "Several money orders that should have arrived for various villages seem to have gone astray. Not lost, exactly, but delayed in the most curious fashion. Poor Constable Davies had been asking questions about it just this past week, taking notes in that little book of his." This information settled into Miss Marple's consciousness with profound significance. If Davies had been investigating postal theft, it would explain both his registered letter to the county offices and the subsequent disappearance of his notebook. Someone had been systematically interfering with the mail, and Davies's meticulous attention to detail had made him a threat that required elimination. As she made her way toward the church, Miss Marple noticed a faint glow emanating from the vestry windows, curious, since the building should have been sealed and empty. The Reverend Clement emerged from the shadows near the lich gate, his keys jingling with nervous energy as he approached the side entrance. "Miss Marple, I was just checking that everything was secure. Inspector Fletcher asked me to ensure no one had disturbed the scene." His explanation came too quickly, and she observed how his hands trembled slightly as he fitted the key into the lock. The vestry interior felt unnaturally warm, the iron stove radiating heat that suggested recent use despite the building's official closure. The Reverend's confusion appeared genuine as he stared at the glowing embers, muttering about having banked the fire properly that morning. Miss Marple approached the ash pail with the innocent curiosity of someone tidying up after an untidy visitor. Among the grey ashes lay several small brass corners, the sort used to reinforce notebook covers, their edges blackened but their shape still stubbornly recognizable. The sight confirmed her growing suspicions about the systematic destruction of evidence, though she made no comment that might alert others to the significance of her discovery. "How very thorough someone has been," she murmured, more to herself than to the Reverend. who was still puzzling over the mysteriously warm stove. Her walk home took her past Captain Pembroke's house, where lamplight revealed the man himself, pacing before his study windows with the restless energy of a caged animal. Juliet Hargreaves sat in a corner chair, her head bent over some needlework, though Miss Marple observed how the girl's attention kept drifting toward the window and the path beyond. The brown paper package was nowhere visible, though a small pile of ashes in the study fireplace suggested that whatever secrets it had contained were now beyond recovery. The sight reminded Miss Marple of something Captain Pembroke had mentioned during his interview with Inspector Fletcher, a reference to his late sister's will and certain irregularities that Constable Davies had been investigating with his characteristic thoroughness. Family wills, Miss Marple reflected, often concealed the most bitter secrets, particularly when guardianship and financial control were involved. If Davies had discovered evidence of impropriety in the administration of family trusts, it would provide a far more compelling motive for murder than a simple dispute over property boundaries. As the first heavy snowflakes began to fall in earnest, Miss Marple positioned herself by her kitchen window to observe the village settling into its evening routines. The Christmas tree lights continued their cheerful blinking, casting shifting shadows across a scene that had become considerably more complex than anyone had initially imagined. The obvious guilt of Captain Pembroke was beginning to seem like an elaborate smokescreen, concealing a conspiracy that involved postal theft, family fraud, and the systematic elimination of an inconveniently honest police constable whose attention to detail had made him a mortal threat to carefully constructed deceptions. The snow that had begun falling with such gentle promise during the evening hours transformed overnight into something more determined, blanketing St. Mary Mead in a silence so complete that the sharp crack of splintering wood carried across the village green like a gunshot. Miss Marple, who had been awake since before dawn with thoughts that refused to settle into any comfortable pattern, drew her shawl close and moved to her kitchen window just as lights began appearing in cottage windows like scattered stars against the white landscape. The commotion centered on the post office, where Mrs. Trimble's horrified cry had awakened half the village. By the time Miss Marple made her careful way across the snow-covered path, Inspector Fletcher was already examining the damaged door with the methodical attention of a man whose neat theories had just encountered an unwelcome complication. The scene within possessed that particular quality of violence that speaks more of desperation than criminal expertise. Letters lay scattered across the floor like fallen leaves, the small safe gaped open with mechanical indignation, and the sorting table had been overturned with theatrical thoroughness. Yet Miss Marple observed how certain elements seemed almost too carefully arranged. The cash drawer pulled halfway out but not emptied, the stamp supplies disturbed but not stolen, the general chaos that somehow managed to obscure rather than reveal the true object of the intrusion. Mrs. Trimble stood wringing her hands with genuine distress, her usually immaculate domain transformed into something unrecognizable. "The registered mail log," she whispered to Inspector Fletcher, her voice carrying the particular anguish of someone whose professional pride had been violated. "Gone completely, along with the parcel manifest for the past week. But the cash, most of it's still here, Inspector. What sort of thief leaves money behind?" The question hung in the crisp morning air with uncomfortable persistence. Miss Marple drifted closer to examine the scattered papers, ostensibly to help with tidying, but actually to observe the curious pattern of destruction. The missing records were precisely those that would document Constable Davies' registered letter to the county offices, along with any other correspondence that might trace the postal irregularities he had been investigating. Near the forced safe, a length of pale twine lay among the debris, the same 7-ply variety she had observed at Mrs. Dollop's bakery and clinging to the church tower door frame. More significantly, the wooden floor bore the clear impression of that distinctive herringbone tread, pressed deep into a patch of melted snow near the entrance. The print was fresh, sharp-edged, and unmistakably identical to the one she had noted on the church steps. Mr. Sims arrived with the breathless urgency of someone responding to crisis, his postman's coat still bearing traces of the night's heavy snowfall. Miss Marple observed how his eyes moved immediately to the damaged safe, then to the scattered correspondence, with the focused attention of someone assessing what remained rather than what had been taken. His left hand, she noted, bore fresh scratches across the knuckles, the sort of marks that might result from forcing a reluctant lock in darkness. Inspector Fletcher's questions revealed the systematic nature of the theft. The missing documents were precisely those that would establish a paper trail of Davies's investigation, while items of obvious value remained untouched. The break-in had the hallmarks of someone intimately familiar with postal procedures, someone who knew exactly which records would prove dangerous and which could safely remain. Captain Pembroke arrived with his customary bluster, demanding to know about proper security measures and criminal negligence. Though Miss Marple noticed how Juliet Hargreaves remained conspicuously absent from the gathering crowd. The girl's mysterious London correspondence and her uncle's financial troubles suggested complications that extended far beyond simple village crime. Dr. Haydock's examination of the forced lock revealed tool marks consistent with professional expertise rather than opportunistic vandalism. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were looking for, he observed quietly to Fletcher. This wasn't random theft. This was surgical removal of specific evidence. The observation aligned perfectly with Miss Marple's growing understanding of the crime's true nature. Davies had been killed not in a moment of passion, but as part of a calculated effort to eliminate someone whose investigations threatened carefully constructed deceptions. The missing notebook, the burned evidence in the vestry fireplace, and now the systematic destruction of postal records all spoke of someone desperate to erase traces of their activities. As the morning progressed and official statements were taken, Miss Marple noticed how certain villagers seemed remarkably composed despite the dramatic developments. Mrs. Dollop moved about with renewed confidence, her earlier nervousness replaced by the satisfied demeanor of someone whose troubles had been resolved. The very twine used in the break-in had come from her shop, yet she showed no surprise at seeing it among the evidence. Young Tommy Finch, hovering at the edges of the official investigation with boyish curiosity, provided the most telling observation of all. "Funny thing, Miss Marple," he whispered as the crowd began to disperse. "Mr. Sims's coat's got snow on it, but his boots are dry as anything, and that brass button's still missing from his uniform, the one you found yesterday by the holly bush." The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with inexorable logic, though the official investigation seemed determined to treat each crime as separate rather than connected elements of a larger deception. The Christmas tree lights continued their cheerful blinking across the snow-covered green, casting shifting shadows that seemed to dance with secrets. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and resumed her steady knitting rhythm, her needles clicking softly as she contemplated the growing certainty that the village's troubles were far from over, and that the most dangerous criminal was still walking freely among them, protected by the very uniform that should have represented justice and safety. The morning brought with it an unexpected telephone call that transformed Inspector Fletcher's methodical investigation into something altogether more urgent. The county offices in Much Benham had received, late the previous evening, a registered packet from Constable Davies containing detailed allegations of postal irregularities, a comprehensive list of missing pension disbursements, and a formal request for immediate audit of the St. Mary Mead post office records. The implications settled over the village hall like frost on glass. Davies had not been killed in sudden passion, but eliminated to prevent the exposure of systematic fraud. Before Fletcher could fully absorb this revelation, Mr. Sims arrived with theatrical breathlessness, carrying an envelope marked "Urgent and Found," he claimed at the rectory door. Miss Marple observed from her corner chair how the postman's eyes moved immediately to assess Fletcher's reaction, rather than displaying the natural curiosity of an innocent messenger. The letter contained what appeared to be Captain Pembroke's confession, written in his characteristic bold script and employing his familiar military phrases. Yet Miss Marple noted how the blue-black ink had not yet oxidized properly, smudging faintly when touched, and how the paper bore the ghost of oil that spoke of hands accustomed to handling bicycle chains and postal sacks rather than gentlemen's correspondence. Fletcher's skepticism proved well-founded when a second visitor arrived, Mr. Pemberton of Pemberton, Wickham and Associates, whose expensive briefcase contained documentation of the systematic embezzlement that had been occurring under Captain Pembroke's trusteeship. The solicitor's revelations painted a picture of financial desperation that provided compelling motive, yet Miss Marple observed how the timing felt too convenient, the evidence too neatly arranged. While Fletcher absorbed these official revelations, Miss Marple excused herself for what appeared to be a casual constitutional, but was actually a carefully planned psychological examination. She found Mr. Sims in his cottage, polishing brass buttons with nervous energy, his hands still bearing the telltale scratches from the previous night's activities. Such a dreadful business at the post office. She began with characteristic mildness, accepting his offer of tea while noting how his movements had grown stiff and watchful. One wonders what sort of person would go to such lengths, especially when so little cash was taken. Her gentle observation about his missing brass button produced an instinctive gesture toward the empty buttonhole, followed by an explanation that came too quickly and carried too much defensive detail. When she commented on his remarkably clean boots despite the heavy snow, his composure began to fray, with visible cracks in his carefully maintained facade. The pale twine on his workbench, identical to that found at both crime scenes, became the focal point of her delicate interrogation. Very versatile, she observed gently, watching his face as he unconsciously twisted the incriminating evidence between increasingly nervous fingers. And so readily available from Mrs. Dollops, I believe. Mr. Sims dropped the twine as if it had burned him, his carefully constructed persona of the diligent, unassuming postman crumbling under the weight of accumulated guilt. His eyes, which had been avoiding hers throughout the conversation, met them briefly with an expression of naked fear and desperate calculation. Meanwhile, the systematic planting of evidence continued its inexorable course. Mrs. Dollop's bakery yielded a conveniently discovered parcel containing money order receipts and pension records, evidence that pointed directly to her involvement but bore the telltale signs of hasty concealment by unfamiliar hands. The flour dust that clung to the papers spoke of someone who knew the bakery's layout but not its daily routines. Young Tommy Finch, whose boyish observations had proven more reliable than adult assumptions, provided the final piece of immediate evidence when he reported seeing Mr. Sims burning papers in his back garden with the furtive urgency of someone destroying incriminating evidence rather than disposing of ordinary rubbish. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow-covered green, the Christmas tree lights continued their cheerful blinking over a scene that had become a carefully orchestrated deception. Captain Pembroke's obvious guilt served as an elaborate smokescreen for crimes that required intimate knowledge of postal procedures, village routines, and the systematic elimination of anyone who threatened to expose the truth. Miss Marple made her way back toward the village hall with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose patient observations had finally yielded their logical conclusion. The forged confession, the planted evidence, and the systematic destruction of documentation all pointed toward a killer who had hidden behind the very uniform that should have represented justice and protection. The village's troubles were approaching their climax, and she knew with absolute certainty where Inspector Fletcher would find the final proof he needed to expose the true murderer. The bells remained silent in their tower, but Miss Marple suspected they would soon ring out the truth that had been so carefully concealed beneath layers of misdirection and calculated betrayal. The afternoon brought with it that peculiar quality of light that precedes the final unmasking of long-held secrets, when truth demands its moment of recognition, despite all attempts at concealment. Inspector Fletcher had spent the morning reassessing his investigation in light of the county officer's revelations about Constable Davies's formal complaint regarding postal irregularities, and the systematic nature of the crimes was becoming increasingly apparent. Miss Marple observed from her corner chair in the village hall as Fletcher methodically dismantled his earlier assumptions about Captain Pembroke's guilt. The forged confession, with its suspiciously fresh ink and telltale oil stains, spoke of hasty fabrication rather than genuine remorse. The financial documents, while revealing clear motive for embezzlement, failed to explain the sophisticated knowledge of postal procedures required for the systematic theft that Davies had been investigating. Understanding that direct confrontation would only allow a clever criminal to construct new deceptions, Miss Marple excused herself with characteristic mildness and made her way to the church, where she requested that the Reverend Clement unlock the building for what she described as a brief examination of the bell ropes before evening prayers. Her suggestion that certain villagers might assist with preparing the church for service provided the perfect pretext for gathering the principal figures in the very location where the truth would finally emerge. The church interior carried that peculiar cold that clings to ancient stone, and the scent of iron and old wax seemed to intensify the atmosphere of expectation. Mrs. Dollop busied herself with arranging holly sprays, her earlier nervousness replaced by the confident demeanor of someone whose troubles had been resolved. Captain Pembroke supervised the alignment of prayer books with military precision, while Juliet Hargreaves moved quietly among the candles with the practiced invisibility of a paid companion. Mr. Sims arrived precisely on schedule, his postman's uniform immaculate despite the morning's dramatic revelations. Miss Marple noted how his eyes moved immediately to assess the positions of the other villagers rather than displaying natural curiosity about the church preparations. His left hand, she observed, moved unconsciously to cover the missing brass button on his coat, a gesture that had become increasingly frequent as the investigation progressed. When Inspector Fletcher arrived with the church keys, Miss Marple positioned herself near the vestry table where she could observe all reactions while appearing to organize hymn books with innocent efficiency. "Inspector," she remarked gently, her voice pitched to carry clearly in the stone interior, "if you were to examine the bell ropes in the chamber, you might find evidence of recent cutting. The ends would show clean cuts rather than natural fraying. Quite distinctive, really." The observation struck Mr. Sims with visible force. His careful composure wavered as Fletcher climbed the narrow tower stairs, and Miss Marple watched how his breathing became shallow and quick when the sound of rope being examined drifted down from above. When a single bell gave a soft, experimental chime, Sims flinched as if the sound had struck him physically. Fletcher descended carrying a length of rope with a clean, recent cut, its pale fibers matching exactly the twine found at both crime scenes. He placed it on the vestry table beside the brass button Miss Marple had discovered, creating a small but damning collection of evidence that spoke eloquently of careful planning and systematic deception. "The curious thing about postal theft," Miss Marple observed with characteristic mildness, settling into a pew as if beginning an innocent conversation, "is that it requires such intimate knowledge of delivery schedules and registration procedures. Someone who could intercept pension disbursements, delay crucial correspondence, and redirect payments to accounts of their own choosing." Her words carried the gentle authority of someone stating obvious facts, yet their implications settled over the gathering like frost on glass. Mr. Sims stood frozen near the vestry door, his carefully maintained facade beginning to crack under the weight of accumulated evidence and psychological pressure. Miss Marple continued with inexorable gentleness, her knitting needles finding their familiar rhythm as she spoke. "Poor Constable Davies was so meticulous about documentation, the sort of man who would never send a registered complaint without keeping careful duplicates, perhaps hidden somewhere he could access quickly if threatened. The bell chamber, for instance, would provide excellent concealment for someone who knew the church intimately." The final piece of psychological pressure proved decisive. Mr. Sims's hand flew instinctively to his missing button, confirming what Miss Marple had suspected since discovering the tarnished brass beneath the holly bush. His breathing became labored, his eyes darting toward the door with the desperate calculation of someone measuring distances and possibilities. "The timing troubled me most of all," Miss Marple concluded gently. "Davies was clearly visible among the carolers at 8 o'clock, yet he died at past. Someone arranged to meet him at the church after the practice ended. Someone he trusted enough to follow into the bell tower alone." The weight of exposure settled over Mr. Sims like a shroud, and his carefully constructed persona of the dutiful village postman finally crumbled completely. Inspector Fletcher stepped forward with quiet authority as the true killer stood revealed at last, his uniform no longer a symbol of trust and service, but evidence of the most profound betrayal of community faith. The Christmas tree lights continued their cheerful blinking through the church windows, casting shifting shadows across a scene where justice had finally claimed its moment of recognition. The weight of accumulated evidence settled over Mr. Sims like a physical burden, his carefully maintained composure cracking under Miss Marple's gentle but relentless psychological examination. Inspector Fletcher observed how the postman's breathing had become shallow and quick, his eyes darting desperately between the church door and the faces surrounding him with the trapped desperation of a cornered animal. "The curious thing about postal theft," Miss Marple continued with characteristic mildness, her knitting needles maintaining their steady rhythm, "is that it requires such intimate knowledge of delivery schedules and registration procedures. Someone who could intercept pension disbursements, delay crucial correspondence, and redirect payments without arousing immediate suspicion." Her words carried the inexorable quality of water finding its level, each observation building upon the last with gentle but undeniable logic. Mr. Sims's hand moved unconsciously to cover the missing brass button on his coat, a gesture that had become increasingly frequent as the investigation progressed. "Poor Constable Davies was so meticulous about documentation," Miss Marple observed, her voice carrying genuine sorrow. "The sort of man who would notice patterns others might dismiss as coincidental delays. He posted that registered letter to the county offices at 7:15, then joined the carol practice with his usual punctuality. But someone arranged to meet him afterward, someone he trusted completely." The image of Davies climbing trustingly to his death cast a pall over the gathering that was almost palpable. Captain Pembroke stood rigid with the outraged dignity of a man whose character had been systematically maligned, while Mrs. Dollop's face had gone ashen as she realized how her innocent provision of twine had been used to secure the crime scene. "You knew he kept duplicates," Miss Marple continued gently, addressing Sims directly now. "Hidden in the bell chamber where he could access them quickly if needed. The struggle must have been desperate when he realized your true purpose. He managed to reach the bell ropes, trying to signal for help, but you struck him with whatever came to hand." Inspector Fletcher stepped forward with quiet authority, recognizing that the psychological breakthrough had yielded more comprehensive results than formal interrogation might achieve. The evidence lay before them like pieces of a completed puzzle: the herringbone footprints, the pale twine, the brass button, the forged confession with its telltale oil stains. Mr. Sims's composure finally shattered completely. His legs buckled, and he sank onto a nearby pew with the defeated posture of someone whose carefully constructed deceptions had been methodically dismantled. When he spoke, his voice carried the hollow quality of a man confronting the enormity of his actions. He wouldn't listen to reason, Sims whispered, his hands trembling as they gripped the wooden pew. Said duty came before everything else, that the law was the law regardless of circumstances. I tried to explain about the debts, the threats from men who don't wait politely for payment, but he just kept talking about proper procedures and formal investigations. The confession poured out with desperate relief. Years of systematic theft disguised as postal delays, money orders redirected to accounts under false names, pension checks that never reached their intended recipients. Davies had been building a case for weeks, documenting every irregularity with characteristic thoroughness. "I never meant for it to go so far," Sims continued, his voice breaking. "Just small amounts at first, things that wouldn't be missed immediately. But once you start, the hole just gets deeper. When Davies said he had evidence, said the county would be here by morning, I panicked. I told him I had something urgent to show him in the bell tower, something that couldn't wait." Captain Pembroke cleared his throat with military precision, though his voice carried an odd tremor. "You made me a public fool, Sims. Used my financial troubles, my temper, even my walking stick to deflect suspicion." His eyes hardened. "But you made yourself something far worse." Inspector Fletcher produced his handcuffs with professional efficiency. "Mr. Sims, you are under arrest for the murder of Police Constable Davies and for the systematic theft of postal funds. The evidence against you is quite overwhelming." As the constables led Sims away, his once proud uniform now a symbol of profound betrayal, a heavy silence descended upon the church. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and resumed her knitting with characteristic composure, though her eyes held a sadness that spoke of human nature's capacity for self-destruction. "Perhaps," she said quietly to Inspector Fletcher, "the bells may ring tonight after all, not in celebration, but in memory of a young man who tried to ring them himself when truth most needed a voice." The Christmas tree lights continued their cheerful blinking through the ancient windows, casting shifting shadows across a scene where justice had finally claimed its moment of recognition, though the cost and shattered trust would linger long after the formal proceedings concluded. The formalities that followed Mr. Sims's confession unfolded with quiet efficiency, though the village required more than handcuffs to settle its profound unease. Inspector Fletcher, recognizing the thoroughness of Miss Marple's deductions, asked her to explain the complete sequence for the benefit of all present. She obliged with characteristic mildness, her knitting needles finding their familiar rhythm as she unraveled the final threads of deception. "Poor Constable Davies discovered the pattern quite by accident," Miss Marple began gently. "Delayed pension payments, missing money orders, complaints from elderly residents who attributed the problems to bureaucratic inefficiency. Being conscientious, he began documenting every irregularity, building a comprehensive case that threatened Mr. Sims's carefully constructed scheme." She paused to observe how the truth settled over the gathering like morning frost. The registered letter Davies posted at 7:15 contained his complete findings, with duplicates hidden in the bell chamber for safety. Mr. Sims knew this, having observed Davies's methodical habits during years of trusted service. He arranged the fatal meeting under pretense of providing additional evidence, then struck Davies with a fragment from the recently repaired vestry tiles. Dr. Haydock would find those distinctive red particles in the wound. Inspector Fletcher nodded grimly. "The bell ropes?" "Sabotaged in advance," Miss Marple explained. "Mr. Sims cut one rope cleanly and rejoined it with pale twine, the same 7-ply variety found at both crime scenes. When Davies realized the danger and attempted to signal for help, the false joint snapped, burning his wrists without producing the full chimes that might have summoned assistance." Captain Pembroke cleared his throat with military precision. "And the evidence against me?" "Deliberately cultivated," Miss Marple replied kindly. "Your financial difficulties, your public arguments with Davies, even the brick dust on your walking stick, all genuine but innocent details that Mr. Sims wove into a compelling narrative of guilt. The forged confession was his masterstroke, written on your letterhead with fresh ink that betrayed its recent composition and oil stains from hands more familiar with bicycle chains than gentlemen's correspondence." Mrs. Dollop wrung her hands nervously. "But why break into the post office?" "To destroy the paper trail," Miss Marple answered. "Davies's registered mail log, parcel manifests, any official record of his investigation had to disappear. The herringbone footprint left at both locations came from Mr. Sims's regulation boots, though he hoped suspicion would remain fixed on the captain." The missing brass button I discovered beneath the holly bush had torn from his coat during the struggle in the bell tower. Juliet Hargreaves spoke quietly. The London letters everyone whispered about. Innocent inquiries about employment opportunities, my dear. Your desire for independence was perfectly natural, though Mr. Sims hoped to suggest darker conspiracies. The brown package you carried contained duplicate correspondence, burned later from embarrassment rather than guilt when your uncle's financial troubles became public. As Inspector Fletcher completed the formal procedures, the Christmas bells began their gentle chiming across the snow-covered village. The sound carried both memorial and promise, honoring Davies's sacrifice while announcing the restoration of trust and order. By Christmas morning, St. Mary Mead had begun its ancient process of healing. Captain Pembroke, humbled but exonerated, walked to service with Juliet at his side, his military bearing tempered by newfound wisdom. Mrs. Dollop bustled about with restored confidence, her innocent provision of twine properly understood. The Reverend Clement had spent the night in prayer for both victim and perpetrator, understanding that evil often wore familiar faces. Young Tommy Finch, whose sharp observations had proved more valuable than sophisticated deductions, ran ahead with boyish enthusiasm, while his parents followed with quiet pride. Dr. Haydock delivered a brief memorial for Davies during the service, speaking of duty, integrity, and the courage required to pursue truth regardless of personal cost. Miss Marple settled into her usual pew with characteristic composure, her reticule containing the small collection of evidence that had revealed such profound deception. The brass button, the strand of pale twine, her careful observations about human nature, all had combined to expose a truth that official procedures might have missed entirely. As the service concluded and villagers began their Christmas visits, Miss Marple reflected on the curious patterns that had emerged from tragedy. The postal theft had been brilliantly conceived, requiring intimate knowledge of delivery schedules and the trusting nature of elderly recipients. Only Davies's meticulous attention to detail had threatened the elaborate scheme. Walking home through the crisp morning air, Miss Marple noted how quickly the community was beginning to heal, though trust in uniformed authority would require time to fully restore. She resumed her knitting with the satisfied rhythm of someone whose patient observations had served justice well, the missionary scarf nearly complete, its intricate pattern reflecting the complex web of human motivations finally unraveled. Outside her window, St. Mary Mead continued its ancient rhythms, Christmas peace restored but forever marked by knowledge that evil could hide behind the most trusted faces. The bells continued their gentle chiming, no longer signals of distress, but reminders that truth, however long delayed, would eventually emerge through careful attention to the seemingly insignificant details that revealed the deepest mysteries of the human heart.